And welcome to the Oddity Archive, the show that's gonna ram context down your throat, whether you like it or not. And with that little snarky opening line in mind, I was actually very much on the fence about even making this episode for two reasons. One, it's a little outside of my usual sphere, and two, it's not the sort of thing that's known to garner a whole lot of clicks. Prove me wrong on that one, please. But the tipping point in my going through with this is that the implications of the actions of this one guy on so many facets, especially legal facets, of archivedom, and not just Oddity Archive, that somebody needs to do it. And I don't think anybody else is ever going to, so here I am. But anyway, today I want to take a look at the dirty life and times of the single most infamous/famous film collector of all time. It's a name I've thrown around on this show before, Raymond Rohauer. So what I'm going to do here is not so much give a biography of the guy, though I will try and hit all the pertinent points, so much as I'm going to deliver a series of anecdotes about him, anecdotes that I think deserve to be shared. So, with that, let's get to business. Raymond Rohauer was born in Buffalo, New York in sometime between January and early November of 1924. The trail goes cold until 1942, when Rohauer moved to LA and enrolled at the Los Angeles City College. Apparently an aspiring filmmaker at one point, Rohauer made a 5-reeler in 1947 called Whirlpool, which appears to be lost. Somehow, by 1950-51, Rohauer attained control of the still-in-operation Coronet Theater on La Cienega Boulevard, where he'd already worked for a few years. This brings us to our list of anecdotes. In a way, places like the Coronet Theater were something that was very much needed in the US in the early 50s. At the time, it was illegal to publicly screen films that contained nudity, not necessarily pornography. However, private film clubs and societies could run such things as it was considered non-commercial. The Coronet was very much considered non-commercial at the time. This distinction allowed Rohauer to run otherwise banned European films, avant-garde films, and the occasional US exploitation films that were never submitted to the MPAA. As such, works ranging from the most prominent European filmmakers to local avant-gardist Kenneth Anger were shown. The latter's film Fireworks, despite the venue's private status, got Rohauer busted by the Los Angeles Vice Squad in 1957. Rohauer's, and as it turned out most of his audience's favorite films, were the classic silents. Rohauer already had a nasty habit of running off personal copies of most, if not all, the films he exhibited, but upon realizing that most of the silent films he'd loaned from the Museum of Modern Art in New York were in the public domain, Rohauer simply started running his, usually very poor, homemade duplicates, complete with the museum's logos and forwards. Rohauer had been trying to make friends with surviving silent film performers and filmmakers as far back as the late 40s. But if Rohauer's own myth-making was true, his favorite actor was Buster Keaton, whose films were almost entirely out of circulation in the early 50s. According to Rohauer, in 1954, he'd acquired and was running a battered copy of Keaton's The General at the Coronet, which was, initially unbeknownst to Rohauer, quietly attended by Keaton and his wife, because Mrs. Keaton had never seen it. Upon hearing that Keaton was in attendance, Rohauer ran out to meet him. After chatting a bit, Keaton invited Rohauer to visit his home the following day. Keaton only had prints of a few of his films, nitrate prints, which is highly volatile, which were at the time believed to be the only surviving copies of said films, which Keaton had long since stopped caring about, which Keaton kept in his garage, where Keaton liked to smoke cigarettes. Rohauer persuaded Buster to first put out his cigarette, then to allow him to take the films so he could copy them to a more stable film stock. Over the next few years, Rohauer and Keaton rounded up copies of most of Keaton's silent films, most of which indirectly came from a stash accidentally left behind at Keaton's old mansion. Thanks to some fancy legal wrangling, Rohauer and Keaton managed to acquire the rights to most of Keaton's still copyrighted silent films. The public domain ones got new or extra title cards and text introductions, which Rohauer proceeded to copyright as new works. This leads us to Rohauer's next and most infamous exploit. I personally have no issue with film preservationists copywriting their restorations, assuming a reasonable amount of care went into them. This wasn't exactly Rohauer's style. He liked to make minimal alterations, again like the odd extra title card and or text introduction, and claim them as new works. Most infamously, one of the few sound films in Rohauer's arsenal, the 1932 horror classic Vampire, added completely pointless text explanations of the implied violence in the movie. In 1970, film preservationist David Shepard skewered Rohauer's habits by giving out, as a Christmas present, intentionally bad 16mm copies of the 1894 test film The Sneeze, aka Fred Ott's Sneeze, allegedly restored by Rohauer. This 5-second test film got dragged out to nearly 2 minutes by adding an increasingly bizarre barrage of title cards. Rohauer was a notoriously litigious man, but amazingly he was, according to Shepard, amused by the parody. Indeed, by the 70s, Rohauer had become so infamous amongst classic film geeks that when his name would appear on screen, they would start booing, which Rohauer seemed to perversely enjoy. Rohauer managed to pull a few films out of the public domain without changing a thing. Quite brilliantly, Rohauer found that sometimes the underlying story of a public domain film, especially if adapted from a book, was still under copyright. You could technically argue that the film is still under copyright as well, specifically as a derivative work of that book. So Rohauer would track down the usually heirs of a deceased author's work, buy out the rights to that work, and claim ownership of the film versions. In the case of 1926's Son of the Sheik, starring Rudolph Valentino, incidentally Valentino's last movie, Rohauer bought the rights to the 1925 novel that it was based on and claimed ownership of the film. In 1971, film preservationist Paul Killiam licensed his own restoration to Newark, New Jersey / New York City PBS station WNET for broadcast. WNET aired the film 3 times between July and October of that year. Rohauer proceeded to sue Killiam, and won. Scarily enough, this method has been successfully used a few times over the decades. How do you think It's a Wonderful Life got seemingly magically pulled out of the public domain in 1993? In 1952, Charlie Chaplin had been under investigation by the House Un-American Activities Committee. That September, on his way to London for the premiere of his film Limelight, Chaplin received a wire stating that he would not be allowed back into the US unless he agreed to a series of interviews about his political beliefs. Chaplin decided he'd rather go home to Europe for good. In the mad rush to get his belongings sent to Chaplin's new home in Switzerland, some items fell through the cracks, such as a major stash of Chaplin's outtakes and daily rushes. At the time, Chaplin's wife ordered that these films be destroyed. They weren't. Someone with access to this stash, which incidentally was held in a bomb shelter, contacted Rohauer, who proceeded to sell Rohauer some 200 metal drums full of films at $1 a pound. Two noteworthy things came from this. One, Rohauer claimed he was able to construct a near-perfect copy of The Gold Rush out of outtakes, a claim that has since been debunked. It's just the regular film. And two, it provided the meat of the 1983 documentary The Unknown Chaplin, which over the span of 3 parts deconstructed and reconstructed Chaplin's working methods through outtakes and deleted scenes. Okay, 2 more short Rohauer stories. This first one comes from the merger of the same story told by film preservationists William K. Everson and Kevin Brownlow. In 1959, Rohauer was in hot water with MGM, probably over a film that they owned, but Rohauer was claiming ownership of. Nonetheless, in the name of easing things over with MGM, Rohauer notified MGM that William Everson was going to show a print of MGM's 1925 version of Ben-Hur, which was still under copyright, without clearance. MGM had just remade Ben-Hur, and Everson wanted to show his print of the original to his film club for compare and contrast reasons. FBI agents attended the screening and, after the show, seized the print. For whatever reason, MGM and the FBI soon dropped the matter, but only after silent film star and at one point MGM's biggest star, Lillian Gish, intervened. Nonetheless, according to Everson, Rohauer spent the next few years boasting that he had gotten the British-born Everson deported back to England. No such thing ever happened. Our final story concerns the still occasionally controversial 1915 epic, The Birth of a Nation. Once established, Rohauer developed a habit of buying out large amounts of footage and stories, sometimes still copyrighted, sometimes not. Among Rohauer's copyrighted purchases were the holdings of the Epic Producing Corporation, which contained the rights to author Thomas Dixon's The Klansman, which was the loose basis for Birth of a Nation. Because Griffith made some kind of financial deal with Epic at the time, presumably to avoid any potential lawsuits, Epic believed that it owned the rights to Birth of a Nation, even renewing its copyright in 1942. In the late 50s, film preservationist Paul Killiam bought out D.W. Griffith's works and proceeded to reissue Griffith's films. Shock of shocks, Rohauer proceeded to sue Killiam, using Epic's copyright renewal as the basis for his case. In a rare backfire against Rohauer, in 1976, it was ruled that Birth of a Nation was too different from Thomas Dixon's book, and that Epic's attempt at copyright renewal was invalid. Only D.W. Griffith himself could have legally renewed the copyright, which he didn't. Didn't stop Rohauer from dragging out the legal proceedings until 1979, though. Did I mention this dispute had been going on since 1964? Oh yeah, and once again, actress Lillian Gish, who actually ostensibly starred in this movie, wound up stepping in to help stop Rohauer, testifying against him in court. To this day, the sheer tonnage of stories about Raymond Rohauer continue to circulate amongst those that knew him, and of course have now been passed down to the next generation. And really, there are, as implied, so many stories that today's episode kind of just amounted to a sampler platter. I mean, I didn't even get into Rohauer's favorite pastime, which was to, at the very least, harass anyone that dared run or even just pull a still image from any of the public domain films that he happened to have copies of, regardless of whether or not it was sourced from one of his prints. Now, yeah, I have ragged on Raymond Rohauer a lot today, but there are some positives to report. So, first and foremost, he really did save a lot of films, and some pretty dang important ones along the way. Films that would have either rotted away or possibly gone up in flames by now. And I should report that by the end of his life, he was not really doing the legal junk anymore. He spent the last years of his life focusing on some proper restorations of some of his movies. So, yeah, I gotta say, he seemed to be trying to turn things around a little by the end. But regardless, Raymond Rohauer died on or about November 10th, 1987. I can't find a concrete date there. At the age of 63. And depending on your source, he either died of a heart attack or of the AIDS virus. The mysteries just never end, do they? But anyway, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I have to deal with all the idiots that decided to make a drinking game out of all the times I used Raymond Rohauer's name in this episode, which I just used again. Oh well.